And hello again. Here we are. We're going to be picking up with Herlihy's Midnight Cowboy, picking up in part 1 in section 3. Before we get started, I just want to say something briefly about these recordings. You notice they're being whispered. I have a standard mic I'm using. I haven't invested in any ASMR ambitions, I'll put it that way. But I'd like to say a couple of things about these recordings and the act of trying to perform some sort of whispered soothe or ASMR recording. Without saying anything, no, I'm going to stop there and say this the way I feel will offer up the most heartfelt statement on the issue. That closest to what I see as the truth of my opinion. That is, last few years we've seen quite a few ASMR artists, we'll call them, sure, okay, pop up all over YouTube, which is great. It's a good thing. I say that as in it's a good thing because people send, I don't know, people tend to show their appreciation for these, and people's channels are being supported by it. I think that's interesting. And without crashing these things, I mean, I've tuned into a couple of them and tried to utilize whatever it is, whatever sort of benefit there is in it, perhaps to soothe and relax, but it just, I'm just going to be open about this without being negative about these things. Occasionally I'll come across one that gives me a laugh, so that's entertaining. I kind of like that. But as for the other things, for the sensory stimulation, whatever, the relaxing, the sound, the soothing of a whispered voice or a low voice or a voice close to the ear, or scratching sounds or tick-tick sounds or clacking sounds with someone's tongue. The problem, it just, maybe it's my generation. I've been conditioned in a different direction from such things, but I just don't get anything out of it. And I tune into them once in a while to see if it's possible, if I can, but I just can't because it's so... Look, this has nothing to do with the future of ASMR. What the hell do I know? I'm not a channel builder. I do what I do for pleasure, my own pleasure, and I put it up there online, and I kind of use the platform as a means of storing information. I don't know, it's just become a habit. But so I'm not interested in the pragmatism of a YouTube channel, and I'm not out to put someone else down. I'm just saying I'm probably not the only one, but it just doesn't work for me. I'm like, this is pseudo. This is pseudo. It's trying to achieve with a blue pill what we do experience in life here and there. If we're, once upon a time we did, a late at night whispering of two friends because they don't want to wake up the rest of the house on a sleepover, or someone whispering or reading to you, the sound of someone's voice, or the personal attention of a haircut, or there's you know, there's, or a doctor's appointment, there's a sense of intimacy there. It's not sexual by nature. It's just some sort of it. I guess it appeals to the inborn need for contact and stimulation of another person. So what I'm getting around to saying is, as much as I understand the appreciation and possible need of such things within people, and that's what stimulates people to appreciate these channels, I would just say that when you look at that and you flip it on its head, it's also important to recognize that it is representative of something rather sad within us in our current state, or your current state, whoever is involved with. I don't know what to say. Like I said, it doesn't. But, however, there is something about it. Sometimes the sound of someone's voice, perhaps, I don't know. And one voice doesn't appeal to one person and it does appeal to another. I don't even know what it's about. If you guys have any thoughts on it, why this is, for sure, just leave them in the comments, I don't know, maybe I'm just pessimistic. Probably so. But I see it as a symptom of a somewhat, I was going to say degenerative, but that's not the word. It's a depravity. And quite clearly you could say people are deprived of a certain level of intimacy between one another. I mean, we got to the point, midway, I don't know, just beyond midway through the first decade of the 2000 decade, right? Where we found that, thank you very much, no need for a phone call here, please just text. I'd rather not phone call unless I absolutely have to, because the phone calls are too confrontational and they take too much, and too much can, this is very simple, get the message out, but but that, you see, that convenience, of which I too am a proprietor and I support it and I utilize that, it is a breaking away from a fuller connection to people. And that fuller connection I'm talking about is just the telephone call. And that's not even real. With someone sitting in the room looking into. That's why it seems like a lot of times when people start talking when they're in person, they both seem so vulnerable to each other, right? Their faces sometimes. Oh my God. I don't know how many times I've spotted this. And some of you have probably noticed this too. You're walking through train cars, or you're walking down the street on the sidewalk, or through a shopping mall, etc., etc. And as the distance between you and another person is closing and closing, as you're getting closer to one another, as you're walking towards one another, perfect strangers, you'll see the other person fumble for their phone and get their phone up to their face and stuff, because it's like it's too confrontational or something. As far as I'm concerned, we don't even have to say hello. You know what I mean? As people, I think in a way we should consider what Slavoj Žižek was talking about, learning to ignore each other politely. You know what I mean? And some people have that skill, and I think it's wonderful. It's like what the Chinese apparently have been doing for quite a while. The not talking. Thank you very much. I'd rather not. Something like that. But that would be antisocial, of course. Which it would be kind of counter to what I'm getting at. What I'm saying is, like, the simple act of text messaging or connecting with each other through comments and messaging and stuff. I love the convenience of it, but at the same time, a callus has grown over us socially, towards our vulnerability is laying under there, pink and untried and weak and frail and scared and timid. But anyway, what I was getting around to saying is that, not, well, I already mentioned that, the look, the fumbling for the phone as strangers close in rather than say hello to each other. I get it. The other thing is, I probably sound like I'm contradicting myself. I think I'm just trying to describe seeing something. Have you ever seen this? You walk onto a subway car, a train car, etc. You step onto the car in the middle of the aisle, start walking down, and your peripheral as well as your forward sight kind of like takes into account your surroundings, who's sitting where, all the people, where you notice it's just, it's involuntary. It just happens. You're like Terminator, right? Let's scan. You're not out to, never mind, bad word. That sounds creepy. But I'm saying you become, your senses make you aware of your surroundings. And you look down, and there's a young person. The last time this happened, it was a girl, must have been, I don't know, she might have been approaching 18, I don't know. She's looking into her phone, and you're just walking by. You walk by, she looks up from her phone, and her face becomes terrified, and you realize, all these things happen in split seconds. Your eyes lock, and for that moment, she's suddenly terrified. It's a real person she's looking at. You know what I mean? It's weird. So it leads me to believe that there's something between the texting and the looking up at something real. There's a disconnect there. That, they're two different things altogether emotionally. Absolutely, we know that. What am I getting at? It's another rant. Here we go. But yeah, I guess I brought that up with the cell phone thing because there's a connection between that and the ASMR addiction thing, where people come into their little space in their little bedroom or whatever, and they curl up with their little phone, which has become their little companion, and this little companion, actually, they can even put a face to it, and this little individual that they feel like they know from watching their videos, and it's the impulse and the inclination, I think, is, I was going to say healthy, but I don't believe it to be that. It's natural, and it's understandable. But I think it's a great big placebo for something that's missing. And the thing that has created that is technology that has fallen onto a generation in a way that hasn't really allowed us to adapt and adjust properly. You know what? I say that, but at the same time, perhaps this is just a personal thing. And, it's an observation I'm making that a lot of other people just don't feel. So it could be all my bad, I don't know, but these are just glimpses of the thoughts sometimes I have about these things. I'm even criticizing myself as I'm exploring these ideas. But that's where I go with the ASMR thing. I don't hate it, but I wonder about it. But when I put it in simple terms, I think there's some sort of either sensory or emotional need that some people some people find is satisfied with them. I hope for their sake it is. It doesn't do much for me. I wish it did, but it doesn't do much for me. I don't feel it's not it's like it's like me comparing. Well, a short time ago, I was living very close to a creek and a ravine. Beautiful, beautiful in the summertime. Flowing, a lot of wildlife, a sanctuary really at the edge of the city, where when you drop down into that ravine, large cavern actually, it's part of the escarpment. It's like you're cutting yourself off from the rest of the city. It even drowns out the traffic sound because of the nature of the structure of the ravine. So you're dropping into like a little Eden. Very peaceful, you know, a place where you could go and record a blog or read a book. That was one of my favorite things. Getting sunbaked and reading out there. Solitary, right? To get away from things after work or, whatever. And, but I kind of compare the ASMR need or experience to what I saw someone post online. It was a virtual walk down the side of a river and a creek, and it's like, no! My God, don't do that! For Christ's sake, stop it! Put on your fucking shoes and your coat. Go out of doors and walk along the creek. Quit. I mean, I'm sorry, I don't mean to sound so harsh, but I'm sorry. If you're in that state where you're turning to things like that, you're not in a good space. You know it, right? Mentally, you know it, right? You go out into the world, perhaps you get a little job, or perhaps you're in school and having to attend. You don't like it, but it's something you have to do, and then when you get home, you insulate yourself. I mean, literature in a big way can be an escape, I suppose, for a lot of people. I don't mind saying that. Sure it is. There's a lot of things to escape from. But when you're doing virtual reality for the real, like, trying to replace the real, like just walking down a creek, count me out. Oh my God. It's kind of sick and sad and stupid, and I don't mean to hurt anyone's feelings for that, but don't do it to yourself. Go out and experience those real things. And be sad that maybe, I was going to say, be sad that a lot of the world doesn't realize the wonderful world that's around us through nature and these walks and stuff. But at the same time, be happy that they're not all crowding in. Oh God, like this one park here in town now. In some areas, I'm going to just say it. I'm just going to say it. Public parks are no longer pleasant getaways for open space. There are certain cultures where people flock into them, crowd into them, to the point where it's like, no, I want to get out of here now because there's just too many goddamn people. It becomes like a concert event on the weekends, a poor man's vacation away to whatever. And it's like, oh God, this used to be such a nice space where, it was wide open space. You could walk through a trail and not see someone for a few of those footsteps. But now it's like a crowding, like a goddamn mecca of something. But that's where the aspect of overpopulation comes in. You get 1,000 people that all get the same idea of taking a back road off the highway during a traffic jam. Guess what? The back road's jammed. and now you're in a worse spot than you were when you were on the highway. You know what I mean? Anyway, my God, 20 minutes in. Let's get to the reading. Picking up in J.L. Herlihy's Midnight Cowboy. We're in Part 1, Section 3. The name of Anastasia Pratt, even though the girl herself was only 15, was legendary to the young people of Albuquerque. Such legends rarely derive from fact alone. Invention, as a rule, takes part in their creation. But the behavior of Anastasia Pratt from the time she was 12 was such that the imagination was stunned. No one, by lying, could have made it seem to be much more bizarre or improbable than it already was. She was known as Chalkline Annie, suggesting the order that had to be maintained in order to serve efficiently the large numbers of boys to whom in a single half hour she made her body available. Behind the silver screen at the World Movie Theater was a large room in which were stored the letters for the marquee uniforms, for the ushers, towels and soap, and various other supplies and equipment. In one corner were stored some ends of carpeting left over from the theater's most recent refurbishing. It was in this corner that the legend of Anastasia Pratt was created in the flesh. She labored as well in various living rooms, bedrooms, parked cars, and garages, in school grounds at night, and even under the sky along certain desert highways in fair weather. But it was on this stack of carpet ends in the storeroom of the World Movie Theater that Anastasia was most often used, and by the greatest numbers. Neither pretty nor unpretty, she appeared to be an ordinary schoolgirl, so ordinary that in light of her actual behavior, the effect seemed almost studied. She wore the usual clothes, skirts, blouses, sweaters, ankle socks, and saddle oxfords. Her hair was chestnut-colored, combed straight back, and held with a clip. She wore no makeup to speak of, merely plucked her eyebrows and dabbed on a little lipstick. In the daytime, you would see her walking, always alone, to and from school, carrying her books and seeming to be as open-eyed and listless and mildly troubled as any virginal and solitary adolescent is apt to be. Unless you knew of her special activities, you would have had no reason to look twice at Anastasia Pratt. But with that knowledge, the contrast between what you imagined and what you saw was astonishing. One young wag referred to her as Virgin Jekyll and Mrs. Hyde. Despite the girl's frame, there were at least 3 persons who were totally unaware of her conduct. 2 of these, of course, were the girl's parents, the father a strict, hard-working, irritable bank cashier, and the mother a thin-lipped, shifty-eyed piano player at the Truth Church. The third ignorant party Anastasia immediately placed her knee against Joe's and began to wiggle in an unmistakably provocative way. Suddenly they were holding hands, just as Joe was beginning to worry about the perspiration emanating from his palm. She took his hand and used it to caress her thigh. Then the girl used her own hand boldly to study the extent of his excitement. Finding it to be considerable, she took hold of his face and begged him to kiss her. Joe was not at all disinclined to do so. In all the excitement, he simply hadn't thought of it. But there was in her request such urgency, such desperation, that when he did kiss her, the girl's lips clung to his mouth, as if she were taking from him some life-giving substance. He felt as if he were administering to a person who had been fatally wounded in an accident, but who was not yet dead. A pack of boys came down the aisle and sat behind Joe and Anastasia Pratt. One of them said, "Jesus, it's Anastasia Pratt." "You're kidding," said another. A third said, "Who's the guy?" "He's kissing her." "Hey, somebody's kissing Anastasia Pratt." "Who is he?" "Who's the guy kissing Annie?" "Hey, Annie, who you got there?" Anastasia turned around in a whining voice and said, "Shut up, please shut up. Give me a chance, will you?" "Give you a chance? I'll give you a chance. Here you are, Annie. Here it is. Me too, Annie. How's this? Want me to knock it against the back of your seat a few times for luck?" Joe did not yet understand what was taking place. He'd seen lots of couples necking in this very theater, and always they had been left unmolested. He was frightened and he was confused. Apparently, in his inexperience, he was doing something wrong, but he hadn't the faintest notion of what it was, and he knew even less how to handle himself in such a situation. One of the gang stood up and leaned over the row of seats and recognized Joe Buck from grade school days. "Hey, it's Buck. It's Joe Buck," he announced, resuming his seat. Joe didn't know the voices behind him, and he was afraid to turn around and look. "Hey, Joe," one of them whispered to him. "You been kissing Anastasia? You better go swallow a drugstore, and I ain't kidding. She's copped every joint in Albuquerque." This voice was not hostile. It was, in fact, friendly and urgent in its tone. Joe then turned and saw a dark Italian boy he remembered from school. His name was Bobby Desmond. Anastasia Pratt got up from her seat and flounced up the aisle. The gang ran to follow her. Before leaving with the others, Bobby Desmond paused long enough to tap Joe's shoulder and say, "Come on." Joe got up and followed. In the back of the theater were 6 boys, all of high school age, blocking an exit.
The situation's gotten entirely out of hand. Our only hope is to pretend that nothing's happening. They all filed up a short flight of steps and into the storeroom. Someone turned on a light. Anastasia said, "Where is he? Where's Gary Amberger?" The tall blonde boy, whose name was Adrian Schmidt, said, "Over on the carpets, Annie, over on the carpets." He went into that corner saying, "Hi, Gare. Anastasia's here." She said, "You're lying. This is just a trick to get me here. I know you boys." And then, "Gary? Gary," she called. "If you're there, say something." A woman's voice, projected electronically, said, "Blow out your candles now, darling, and make a wish." "No," said the little girl's voice. "We haven't sung Happy Birthday yet." Then there was much shouting from the screen, and a chorus of people saying Happy Birthday. Anastasia said, "I want out of here," and that got the door closed, for everybody in the room except Joe knew she did not want out of there at all. "I still don't believe he's back there," she said, "but I'm going to take a look just the same." In the corner, Adrian Schmidt was lying on the carpets, exposed, handling himself, and then all the boys were exposing themselves, and then Anastasia Pratt was lying on the carpets, demanding petulantly, as she pulled down her panties, that somebody nice has to be first, otherwise nothing doing. Adrian Schmidt was told he had to wait till last as punishment for lying to her about Gary Amberger, but she had known there wasn't any Gary Amberger anymore. Gary Amberger had moved to Battle Creek, Michigan 3 years earlier, and everybody knew it. While the young men labored over her, Anastasia lay perfectly still, her head to one side, biting her nails idly and not paying much attention to what was taking place. She was like a doomed cancer patient taking radium treatments that can't possibly help, but taking them nonetheless, just in case. To one of them, she said, "Hurry up. I haven't got all night. What do you think this is?" But nothing the girl said carried much conviction. At his turn, Joe climbed on, and Anastasia release him. She wept quietly and held onto his back for dear life. Okay, said Adrian Schmidt. I've had it. I have had it. I count 10, and then, is that fair or isn't it? I mean, I count 10 and then 1, 2, 3. The voice of another old lady from Hollywood said, now don't forget, children. We're all the family poor Sarah has, and it's our duty as Christians. This was followed by a door slam, 20 times louder than life. Anastasia put on her panties and would not allow Adrian Schmidt to touch her. He came at her as if to beat her up, but the other boys held him away from her. She marched out of the storeroom and down the short flight of stairs and into the passageway, holding her head absurdly high and staggering as if she were slightly drunk. As she passed under the exit sign, the screen was producing some truly glorious music to accompany her re-entry into the dark of the world movie theater. In adolescence, a person is apt to do a lot of walking past places. He loses his imagination to someone and then, afraid to declare himself openly, he walks past the place of that someone on all sorts of dreamed up pretexts, hoping for a miracle, or at least a glimpse. Joe lost himself to the idea of becoming a part of that pack of boys with whom he had shared Anastasia Pratt in the storeroom at the World. But Adrian Schmidt, the tall, blonde, pimpled, impatient loudmouth of the pack, blamed Joe for the rebuff he had suffered that Friday night. And so, when Joe took to walking past the magazine store that was their hangout, Adrian glowered at him through the window in a way that would have discouraged almost anyone. And then he turned the others, all except Bobby Desmond, against Joe, so that one day as he passed by, they all came out on the sidewalk and made kissing sounds at him. At the same time, Anastasia Pratt, having lost her imagination for Joe Buck, took to walking past his house. Each afternoon, when school was out, she could be seen walking slowly down his street. Joe watched from behind the Venetian blinds in Sally's living room, noticed how, like an infant, she cradled the school books in her arms, was impressed by the coolness with which she kept her face aimed straight ahead, while out of the corner of her eye she worked the place over like a burglar casing a jewelry store. One day she stopped at each house on the street, rang the doorbell, and offered for sale tickets to a raffle being held by the Truth Church. "Oh," she said, pretending surprise as Joe Buck opened his door to her. "I had no idea you lived here. Our church is raffling a rotisserie, and it's electronic and all. Have you lived here long? I mean, would you like to buy one? A ticket?" Joe looked at her lips as she spoke, and then he looked past her, hearing in his mind the kissing sound of Adrian Schmidt, and he shook his head. No, he didn't want to buy a raffle ticket. The girl knew what he was saying no to, and without actually moving, her face strained toward him, her eyes watery and deeply troubled, and she said, "Are you sure?" He nodded. Anastasia quickly turned and walked down the steps and up the path toward the sidewalk. Her rear end moved back and forth, in a way that made his stomach jump, and then he noticed how sorry her back was, how sad and lonesome the backs of her knees looked, and then he heard himself saying, fairly loud. When she turned to him again, Joe said, "I don't know if I got any change," and the tilt of her eyebrows pulled at his heart. And so Joe's first woman was this 15-year-old Chuckline Annie Pratt. They hid like thieves. He was ashamed of her and of himself. He hated paying the price she exacted, those desperate kisses. And yet, because her need for them was so great, it thrilled him to administer them. In his idleness, he had too much time for brooding. He was forever making promises to himself that in her presence were impossible to keep. He would think of the mound of her stomach and the moist smaller mound below it. And these thoughts, coupled with some sense of her terrible lonesomeness, made idiots of his resolutions. Then one day the parents of Anastasia Pratt received an unsigned letter appraising them not only of the girl's elaborate carnal generosities in the storeroom of the World Movie Theater, but of her visits to Joe as well. Mr. Pratt came to the house one evening, intending to beat the life out of that boy, but he was a small man and ended by doing something else. He went to the police. Joe never learned what transpired at the police station, but the next afternoon, Sally telephoned him from downtown saying, "It's all over, precious. They're putting the poor girl in a nice home." A nice home was Sally Buck's euphemism for an insane asylum. The ending of Anastasia Pratt's career caused considerable talk. Joe Buck's name, having been linked with it, achieved a certain notoriety. The stories that circulated were not always accurate. In one version, he had forced her to these multiple acts with others for her own financial gain. In another, he had made her pregnant, and it was also told that he was formed in a certain way that drove the girl mad. Gradually aware of his new position in the town, Joe was ashamed and embarrassed. Soon everything about his life, his truancy, his idleness, his dependence on his grandmother, piled one upon the other, and he developed an acute sense of his own worthlessness. He despised the very thought of asking anyone for a job, and since nothing in his life pressed him to do so, he continued to avoid it. Sally Buck's shop was thriving, and she showed no concern over him whatever. Apparently his lack of employment, even as it extended into his 19th year and then into his 20th, did not seem to her in any way remarkable. She continued to furnish him with the money that clothed and sustained him, and she paid him as little attention as ever. She kept the yard in shape and washed Sally's car occasionally, and once he painted the house and he kept the yard in shape and washed Sally's car occasionally, and once he painted the house and made some repairs on the roof. Now and again, he would drift into a purely sexual connection with someone, always with the shameful certainty that he was somehow being exploited and made a fool of, and yet hopeful that one of these experiences might bring about a real and friendly alliance with someone. Bobby Desmond was a typical case. For a brief period, perhaps a week or so, having long since broken away from the pack at the magazine store, Bobby sought out Joe's company, took him for rides in his car, and stopped by the house now and then with a six-pack of beer. As it turned out, this young man merely wanted the experience of being used by Joe in the same way Anastasia Pratt had been used by him that night in the storeroom of the World. Joe there's not much new to don't, so don't do anything I wouldn't do. Love, Joe. P.S. They call me Cowboy here. That was true. Some sergeant one day called him Cowboy, and others took it up. He was pleased and began to walk in a new way. Also, he developed the habit of hooking his thumbs into his back pockets as if his trousers were a low-slung gun belt. There was much complaining in the army, and Joe found he had as much to complain about as anyone else, and so he learned at last to take part in conversations. The young men clustered around the big table in the barracks said "shit" a great deal, and some of them called each other man, and one young soldier who claimed he was from Cincy goddamn Nandy had this remarkable system of fitting crosswords into unexpected corners of his talk. Joe liked these mannerisms and adopted them for his own use. Bit by bit, he was acquiring a personality, a style of his own. All in all, he was having a pretty good time, and the months passed more quickly than is usual in the army. In October of his second year, he wrote, Dear Sally, well, there is 59 days to go, and then I will re-enlist. Ha! That is a big joke. Ah. Question mark. Did you die laughing? Yesterday was an inspection. The brass has not got anything else to do, so they have inspection. Well, that is all the news for now, so be a good girl and keep the home fires burning for your favorite boyfriend. And besides, you are the only thing I miss, so the hell with it, eh? Accidentally, I passed the inspection. It was easy. Well, so long. Love, Joe. This was his last letter to Sally, and he was never certain she received it, for back in Albuquerque, something terrible had taken place. His grandmother found a new beau who owned a big ranch. The man was a few years younger than Sally, and this disparity in their ages seemed to necessitate the telling of a few white lies. For instance, she told him something that had not been entirely true for 45 years, that she could ride horseback. People were to say later that this beau should have known better than to allow Sally Buck to ride anything at all, as it should have been clear from one glance that the poor little thing was brittle as glass. But one Sunday afternoon, this lady, at the age of 66, mounted a raspberry roan and rode off into the desert with her sweetheart. That was the end of Joe Buck's fourth blonde. The horse threw her, and the old lady simply broke to pieces. This news reached him late one afternoon, while he was cleaning his truck at the motor pool. A chaplain's assistant came over to him and handed him a telegram from a woman who worked in Sally's shop. Dear Joe, your precious grandmother, killed falling from horse. God bless you. Deepest sympathy. Funeral Friday. Marlita Bronson. When Joe had read the telegram several times, the soldier from the chaplain's office asked him if he was all right. Joe didn't seem to understand the question. He went behind the truck and stayed there. After a few moments, the other soldier found Joe lying on his side under the truck, shaking from head to foot, the telegram stuffed into his mouth, his arms clasped about himself. The young assistant didn't know what to do. Are you all right, soldier? He asked, but there was no answer. A little later he said, fancies. He stayed on in the hotel for a few days, spending most of his time up in his room with the shades drawn. Night and day became confused, and he didn't always remember to eat. He slept a good deal and had nightmares. Awake or sleeping, he pined for Sally Buck, sometimes calling out for her. Once he was certain she came into his room while he slept and sat on the edge of his bed. He awakened, and there she was, fidgeting with her fingers, as real as could be. He saw her face in profile. She was looking at the night sky through the open window. He said, "Sally, what am I going to do?" But she gave no sign of having heard him. And then she said something, but it was unclear. She had said either, "I'll get my house back," or "I can't ride horseback." Whichever it was no help at all to Joe. But he was glad she'd shown herself to him once again. One night, he dreamed a dream that would become recurrent, a dream of an endless chain of people marching across the side of the world. From his vantage point in some chill and dark and silent corner, he could see them coming up from over the eastern horizon, all joined at the belly button by a golden rope of light, and walking to a rousing march beat, and he could see them moving along until they had gone out of sight behind the western horizon. There were people of all kinds, bus drivers and nuns, musicians and soldiers and 10-cent store girls. There were Chinamen and pilots, hillbillies and fat men and red-headed women. You could find miners and bank clerks there, millionaires, store detectives, swamis, babies, grandmothers, thieves. Look for any kind of person in this golden rope, and there would be one. A whore, a dwarf, a saint, a crazy man, cop, teacher, reporter, pretty girl, bookkeeper, shortstop, rag picker. There seemed to be every kind of person but his own. He made many attempts to join them, running up close to the marching stream of golden people, hoping to discover an opening big enough to slip into, but just as he would fit one, there would be a rapid closing of ranks. The chain would become tight and exclusive and impossible to break into, and the dreamer was forced to remain always on his chill and dark and silent edge. After this dream, Joe could no longer remain in that hotel room. He dressed and went into the nighttime streets of Albuquerque, wondering how such familiar places could be so strange to him. "You may know us," said the buildings of the town, "but we don't know you." He walked over to the old neighborhood and stood outside Sally Buck's house. The place was empty.